For episode 12 of Coffee and Communications, the Impact Cast, we were joined by Chief Analytics Officer of Holmusk, Joydeep Sakar. Holmusk is building the largest real-world evidence platform, starting with behavioural health, combining a leading behavioural health database with AI-powered analytics and digital solutions. Prior to Holmusk, Joydeep led the scientific and computational teams at Immunetrics and Bodylogical. He has a PhD in Biomedical Engineering from Case Western Reserve University. Thank you for joining us. I believe you're in Singapore right now, but obviously
for a change.
For a change. I normally have to catch you sometimes in America as well. So I think we just dive right into this. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Kind of how did you end up? I've obviously given a bit of a spiel of your background, but I'm sure that doesn't actually say much about it. How did you end up as a Chief Analytics Officer at Holmusk?
Well, I didn't end up as the Chief Analytics Officer at Holmusk. I ended up as a person leading the data science team and trying to grow out a data business. I mean, which was Nawal's original intent from when he started Holmusk, is really to develop a data business, because he comes from the sort of the data and quantitative side of the financial business. He used to be a trader at Wall Street. And so his point was there's much to be done in healthcare, so let's do it. And I was one of the guys he chose to run with it. Over time, he felt that I was contributing enough to get me a seat on the management table, but that was his choice. I don't know whether I deserved it at that point or not, because you never know these things. But it's been a nice ride. It's been more than 4 years now. And we've come a long way, of course. So I chose Holmusk mostly because I met the data science team, the small one that existed. I met the broader team, and I also actually went down and actually met Nawal in North Carolina. He was visiting, and I was still in DC, and I could see myself working with him, and that's how I chose. It's a leap of faith to a certain degree, I guess.
Okay. Was it your background? Obviously, you've got biomedical engineering, PhD, and you've kind of done a couple of jobs before after that. Like, do you feel like this was a natural kind of direction to kind of go in?
Yeah, you could say that. Obviously every job is different. I had never worked in behavioral health, and this whole concept of real world data and how do you work with real world data, and the intricate stupidities about real world data didn't exist for the longest time. It's a really up and coming field in some ways. So in that way, this was a new challenge, and a new disease state, new set of things to try. But beyond that, how do you work with data? How do you actually drive insights for the healthcare industry? I had significant experience on that side specifically.
Okay, interesting. And I suppose that's I want to kind of come back to asking you a little bit about kind of the jump from Pricewaterhousecoopers to essentially kind of the startup world. But actually, that's probably a nice segue to just kind of, can you just tell us a little bit more about Holmusk? Obviously you've mentioned it, but like, what's its mission? How does that practically play out in affecting, say, the real world kind of healthcare system? And has anything changed since its inception in 2015? What has that journey been like?
We're a startup. So if we knew when we started, even when we joined, I don't think real world evidence and being able to make a statement that we're going to build the biggest real world evidence platform for behavioral health was not a statement that we even thought of necessarily. So I think that even that statement by itself shows evolution of our own ambition above everything else. And that ambition comes from prior success, prior validation from external partners that we're doing something that's meaningful, both from a research perspective, and as well as a commercial perspective. Beyond that, I would say our mission is truly to transform the way clinical research is conducted and clinical practice is conducted in the sphere of behavioral health, so much so that we can actually improve lives of patients. Um, and you have to connect several dots. You have to be independent enough that you have to be able to work with the pharma companies because they're the ones who are coming up with more and more of the different therapeutics, whether that's digital therapeutics or whether that's drugs or there's devices and other procedures coming up. You have to then tie it back to the providers where it's a question of who is best suited with what kind of treatment, under what circumstances, and how do you help the healthcare providers make those decisions. And last but not the least, you have to tie it back to who pays for it, which is where the insurance companies or the governments come into play in terms of how do you justify why somebody needs a particular type of treatment, how does that actually impact them, how does that help the economy, how does that help the healthcare economy, all of those details. In psychiatry, the specific challenge that we recognized is a complete lack of data that's objective and quantitative in nature, based on which you could even make these decisions. So our journey started with understanding what data is actually needed in what form, and then so that you can tie it back to the kinds of questions we were answering. So it's literally we knew the kinds of questions and backtrack what is and how do we do that. And so there's an evolution of that. There's a lot of unstructured or like textual data that we have figured out AI models to translate, if you could say. Lots of different types of techniques being added to get to that answer. And it's cracking that piece that has actually taken most of the time and showing that what we have developed or generated has both clinical and commercial value. Now it's more of a question of how, now that we know we can do these things, it's how do you develop a commercially successful company, and that comes with scale on one side. How do you actually deliver the changes when it comes to the pharma companies? And this is where the partnerships come into play. And how do you actually improve the lives of the patients? This is where the partnerships with the healthcare institutions come into play. And so there's a bunch of different types of institutions, whether that's here in Singapore or in US, NHS, China, that we are working with in different stages of development to make a change.
That's fascinating. And actually, one question that really does pop into my mind, actually, that you start talking about at the end is, I mean, the US system is, especially on a kind of government public institution level, has rapidly changed over the last 10 years with kind of the move to more kind of nationalized healthcare system. And obviously UK is very different because of the NHS, and then China has its differences, Singapore has its differences. How hard is it for you guys to take what you're doing from one country to another? How difficult is it to adapt? What are the challenges you face?
It's interesting. So I'll put it three different ways. Pharma has the exact same challenges everywhere, which is how do I prove that my drug that I'm coming up with new is better than what exists and in which patients, and ultimately such that the doctors use it and the payers pay for it. The doctors are roughly the same. In terms of the healthcare institutions are always overburdened, and they still lack the insights of which patients actually need more care, which patients they can see from a distance and let them coast. It is about the same. Now, you would see that the challenge can be of different scale. Like if you go to China, the scale of the problem is quite different, whereas as compared to, let's say, US or UK or here in Singapore. And there are obviously custom problems in each space, but the basic premise of those problems are roughly the same.
Okay.
Now, how each of these places make decisions around what to pay for, how much, and all of that is absolutely different. And I think that's where the primary difference is the economics of the healthcare economy. And I think that's where we have to adapt significantly market in terms of how we commercialize what we commercialize, who pays for what. I mean, if you go to the NHS, the trusts get paid, and it is a somewhat of a value-based system, so they have an incentive to do better, especially these kinds of mental health trusts. So they are incentivized. US depends. Depends on what segment of the population, what segment of the healthcare system are you talking to, how big or small they are. They can be quite different. Singapore is less about cost and more about effectiveness. China is, forget everything else, how do I treat so many patients?
Yeah.
How do I coverage? So the problems, that's where who pays for what is the problem, the focus changes. But the crux of what we're solving doesn't actually change.
Okay.
That's the best part.
Has there been any, like, obviously, I mean, I'm going to come back to the pandemic and talk about the company just a bit wider, but like on the healthcare front and on that kind of front, has anything kind of has anything shifted or changed dramatically because of the pandemic?
I would say two things. Throughout the world, people moved from in-person care to telehealth. They were forced to. And the adoption of technology has suddenly skyrocketed to a large thing in the healthcare system, which doesn't like to adapt to anything. So there is a move. So this idea of digital first or digital solutions, being able to do things with that, and the pressure of having to not being able to see and the uncertainty around it is forcing people to say, yes, you know what, I do need more solutions. This is not going to work. I have no idea when I will go, if ever, will go back to a place where I will see the patient and I will get 15 minutes to see the patient.
Yeah.
So if I cannot do that, but I need to take care of the patients, what do I do? That's one, across the world, I would say. Two, I think people, not just the patients and the people at large, but also everyone recognizes there's a ground surge, if you may say, of the awareness that mental health is important. And our current lives are not that great at balancing it out, and then suddenly you isolate people, and it gets really difficult for most people very quickly. And the need for more support has skyrocketed. As one very high up leader in one of the insurance companies in the US told us, that the mild have become medium, the medium have become severe, and the severes are really doing bad. And then there's a tsunami of mild coming at us.
Yeah.
And we're so not equipped to handle this. So there is this focus on behavioral health. We've all gone through our individual phases of drinking more than we wanted to during our lockdown periods, which again brings back the focus on the relevance of substance use in mental health and how it affects mental health.
Yeah.
So these things have brought it into the forefront, which helps people like us, for sure.
I mean, that's fascinating because, I mean, it's just, obviously I'm not kind of within the healthcare industry, but you're seeing the discussion around mental health now taking far more prominence. I mean, in the US, obviously it has a little bit more, and even with the Olympics, we're talking about mental health because of
Simone Biles.
Exactly. But Singapore, a place that traditionally hasn't really talked about mental health openly, has had far more articles, even in the last month, where it's saying mental health has to be talked about. And so it feels like, yeah, there's definitely been this kind of change. And like you say, the pandemic just has sped up even just people who generally cope with things fairly well have, shifted, closer to not being able to cope with things. And then, that, like you say, that tsunami. So that's actually very, very interesting. So jumping back, and we are going to come back to the pandemic a little bit and kind of how Holmusk is just as a company kind of adapted, because I think everyone's kind of gone through different ways. But I wanted to ask you actually, what was it like? Because we have a lot of startup founders who listen to this podcast, and we have a lot of founders who have been on the podcast. What was it like to make a jump from PricewaterhouseCoopers, a known entity where you're going to be assured they're here next year and the year after and all this kind of stuff, to Holmusk, where you believe in it, but at the same time, you kind of are jumping a little bit into the deep end. Kind of, what was that like? What did that like? Were you confident as that of that jump? What did you have to go through in order to kind of get to that point?
Well, I knew that I had a kind of a negotiation with the wall that I will need about 6 months from the point I joined to see any traction. And I knew I needed more like 3 to 4, but I asked for 6 to have some buffer.
Yeah.
And post that, it's about run. Okay. I will say this, that even inside PwC or any other large organization, you are still selling. You're still, even if it's a name brand in some ways and you already have established clients, if you try to do something that's innovative, if you try to do something that's out of the most normal, standard, traditional business, you still have to go through the process of winning over both internally and externally. The delta or the extra that you get, mileage that you get, is you're already in bed with the client in some ways. They trust you, so you have a little bit of that trust factor, and then you don't have to make cold calls in some ways. You can get a meeting with them relatively easily. But then the flip side is you also see a lot of internal pushback saying, why the hell do I disrupt the client or disrupt my project? Here you are a bit more of a lone wolf, all out on your own, and really leveraging the pool of network that I had, the pool of network that Nawal had developed, and the advisors that their pool of network, to get those introductions, to get those first couple of meetings so that they would even entertain a meeting. And the strike rate is not high to begin with because you are such an unknown entity, and you have to be prepared to answer the question, why the hell would I talk to you, and why do you think you can do anything? And don't take it to heart. It is what it is. I mean, you have to answer that question, get on with it, and find the best way, and try 15 and see which one clicks where, and then you know which ones to throw at. You have to not think of the future, because that will scare the shit out of you.
Yeah.
But more ride the high and make the best of it.
Interesting. And would you say there's obviously a lot of, I think you were just saying it there, but kind of resilience involved, where you're just like, I'm not going to get an answer to this, or I'm going to have to kind of, that's a rejection, and you've got to kind of roll with the punches and move on.
Yeah. It's part of the job. You will get a lot of no's in the beginning, and that's okay. But it's also about, this was not going to be the first no I was going to get either. So it's okay. It's knowing enough and preparing enough and talking to enough people so you know that you have done the best job in positioning and talking about whatever is it that. And then there are 2 ways of thinking about it. Oh my God, somebody said no, or it's okay. What I really need is not anyone and everyone, but the right people who can recognize the potential of what we are here to offer and get on with it. So flip it. Like, do you actually qualify? Are you a person who can actually value this? Only then I'll choose you as a partner. If you flip your mindset like that and approach things, it's better.
Okay, so if you were to say, like just naming, say, three traits, characteristics of someone you think that will survive or be able to handle the startup kind of world, what would they be? Obviously, not just necessarily thinking like looking at Holmusk and the type of people that are there, you know, the founder Noel and things like that. What are like the types of characteristics you think are important?
Um, you have to be able to reinvent nonstop. Because there is, in the early days, you pivot and you pivot and you pivot. And that's just the way it is, because you find, even though you know where you want to go, you don't know the path to get there. So you're looking for the path and you might hit a wall. Don't try to keep banging on the wall. Pivot so that you find the gap through which you can make the path. Don't be a pessimistic. It doesn't help. Because you will fail over and over. You will get a lot of no's, and that's okay. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but you kind of have to learn to leave it for what it is and walk away. Hopefully learn something. Many of times you won't. Okay, I tried, I wanted, didn't get it. Okay, all right, move on. Which is just a little bit of a perseverance kind of situation, but smart perseverance, I would say. But it's also about understanding the fact that most people that you will speak to are not going to judge you from a technical or content perspective. Very few people you will run into who are making those decisions are making them based on a purely logical view of how good is the tech or the data or the method. 90% of the time, I do not see that being the basis of people making decisions. That is mostly a checkbox. Does the tech look okay? Yes. Does this what they're really looking for is, can I trust this guy? And to that end, to put yourself in their shoes and think about how you can de-risk something for them so that they can take that first step. The more you can do that, especially towards the beginning, the better off you are. So a little bit of that business model innovation around how things can be structured, so much so that they feel comfortable making that first step, goes a long way.
That's fascinating, and I think it's something to really, really reinforce because, that it's not necessarily the tech. You may have a great product or whatever, but they've really kind of got to trust in you. And there's a lot of what I see from when I speak to investors. They're like, I mean, half the time I don't like, a lot of investors don't even necessarily have enough information about the industry. So they're not experts, so they're not going to be experts after you talk to them. But having faith in you and your team and things like that is actually very, very important.
Yeah, every day.
There you go. Take that away, everyone who's listening. I wanted to actually, one thing that when I was reading up about Holmusk that really fascinated me was, I mean, you obviously have a global team and it's incredibly diverse, both in a sense of sort of geography, the kind of ethnicity, and also the kind of gender split, I think, at the company. And when we talk about a world where we've made some great strides, but women are still constantly locked out of many, many different areas, and healthcare is the same as many. Can you talk us through that? Is that a kind of conscious decision at the company? Like, can you just talk us through that kind of, like, how Holmusk ended up where it is?
It's still not where we want to be, but it is an actual challenge. Diversity in terms of ethnicity is also not easy. I'll give you an example, which is you could be looking for specific senior candidates. Okay, so let's put it this way. If it's up to the just the bottom of the senior leadership. So if you talk about the, some kind of a hierarchy where senior leadership ends, that and below, it's very easy to have diversity both in gender and ethnicity, race, whatever you call it. Mostly because you have enough flexibility to say, I need more women, so I'm going to wait it out till I get the right candidates, or I'm going to just preserve this people, because most of the time we plan ahead and we have a little bit of time. It's not immediate. The challenge we face is the higher up you go, no matter what you do, you need. I mean, even if I say I'm going to hire a non-white guy, and you make that very clear to the recruiter, and after 3 months they say, I can't find a single one. What do you do as a company? I cannot, as a company, in all certainty, especially when we're talking about 150 people and they're important hires, there's only so long I can say, no, that matters to me more than the company.
Yeah.
It is a hard decision. So we ourselves are also struggling at the very, very top level to find enough diversity across the world to be able to hire. But what we are then resorting to is the fact that, okay, we hired a certain group of people because it is what it is. And if you look at our management, it's 2 Indians, 3 Indians and 3 Caucasians and 1 woman out of the 6, which is not great. 5 guys, and then we might add another 6th white guy just because of the way it turns out to be. But what we are now talking about is, you know what? Okay, so we can't find people outside who we can easily hire who are the right fit. Great. But there are enough diverse people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, who are rising up the ranks. Let's create more opportunities for them to go to the point that they are a part of the topmost tier. That's the only solution at this point.
And I think that's fascinating because, I mean, you're still, let's be honest, relatively a young company. It's kind of very interesting that you're embedding, because we talk a lot about culture of companies, about making sure as you do scale, you're aware of different things internally. And so I think it's very interesting that you're already embedding that and kind of into your culture out of both a necessity, but also because it's the thing, having diversity actually helps a company grow. It helps, improve management decisions. So I think it's a very important lesson that general startups should learn, which is you need to embed this early.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is one. The other thing is, to be honest about it and mean it when you say that most people, like, people's voices matter. And you actually listen and pay attention to what the majority of the people are asking for or talking about, not just window dressing. To mean it hard, and I'm telling you honestly, it's not easy with all the work pressure, deadlines, and financial pressure you are always on. It is not an easy balance to strike. What you realize is that it's not the top 6, it's the remaining 144 that make things happen.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So if you gotta give them a voice, you gotta give them a place for them to say what they need.
And I think it generally fits into a bit more of a trajectory of just people today and their expectations and desires within the workplace anyway. People are seeking, especially younger people, not us. We're getting a bit long in the tooth, but younger people look for more than just, hey, I've got a job that people recognize and I'm getting some kind of power. I want more fulfillment from it. So I think it's important to have that. So I wanted to loop back around actually just to the pandemic, less about sort of healthcare systems and more just about you as a company, because I think everyone's kind of gone through this massive change. You're a company startup raising, and America's like a key market and all this kind of stuff. So, what are some of the challenges that you, as a company, has actually faced? In terms of just kind of moving forward, whether it's internal and external, and kind of how have you met some of those challenges?
So we did well on some fronts. We didn't do well on some fronts. So we closed Series A. By the time the money got to the bank, Singapore was in circuit breaker. And people were all scattered, and our celebration was over Zoom. I don't think we ever really got to celebrate the fact that we were able to raise Series A. It's been such a crazy year. We had a very aggressive growth trajectory. So in the year and a few months that we has gone by, we went from 43 to 135 people. So you can imagine that we were able to hire people across the globe. In that way, we did well. Some of the things that we thought, like hiring of some of the senior executives, took longer just because all the uncertainty and everything around it, people were not as comfortable making jumps immediately, or they took longer before they made decisions. And Zoom and how when people have time, none of us could meet, so you had to spend more time talking because you're like, I don't know, I've spent 45 minutes on Zoom with this guy, I don't know if I can make the choice.
Yeah.
So I think it just both sides took much longer to make those decisions. Commercialization, because we were not meeting clients, closing deals got harder. And also people were very, very scared of what's to come. So I think people did pull back in closing deals. We took that opportunity to build as fast as we could build. So it helped us in some ways. Doesn't always show, but we went to but also the challenges, when we grew like that, then I realized our calendars were just completely full of Zoom calls. So we didn't realize what we were doing, and we went, and then at some point we had to say, okay, we need to scale this back. People should not be spending 11 hours on Zoom every day. Let's pull back. What is reasonable? How many Zoom calls can you do and be effective? How do you plan it around such that you have blocks of time where you're not on Zoom and you're just working on your own, or writing stuff or thinking stuff, where these are the times. I created my own hygiene, saying, okay, I'm not going to take calls this night, because if I keep taking calls every night, I will go crazy. How do I block time for my workouts? So you literally have to plan your way around this. Personally, every one of us, and encouraging everyone and warning everyone so that they do take care. Keeping an eye out on every member every time you see them on Zoom. Do they look too tired? Do they look disengaged? Are they okay? It's a huge burden.
And I think it's very important. When you talk about mental health earlier, obviously the internals of your company are super, super important. And I've known some good companies who have really, factored in sort of that, even if they didn't do it necessarily at first. I wouldn't blame any company for losing sight of it in the first couple of months of the pandemic, because we were so caught out, and then we suddenly had to change our lives, and suddenly an 8 p.m. call is fine, and then suddenly a 2 p.m. a.m. call is fine, because we've got to make it work for the globe. But I think a lot of companies also realize this is not sustainable. But I've also been surprised by how I've seen some companies not necessarily really understand that, and sort of haven't really factored in the mechanisms to ensure people are kind of have their wellness. And that can be especially hard for Asia, because you find yourself in between the US time zones and the European time zones. And I've often seen friends and people I know in startups and things like that, or not startups, bigger companies, sorry, be the ones that are actually unfortunate because they're stuck with the bad timing quite a lot of the time. So
I mean, we try to. It is a hard balance to strike. Um, and I I'll say it this way. Um, Generally, the topmost leadership doesn't have as much of the flexibility
Yeah.
as some of the others do. We not often, we have to make, um, we have to take calls or do things that are not congenial, but I don't think we can say in a startup, well, no, I don't do such things. You can't say those things.
Yeah.
Okay. But we try to shield most of the team as much as possible. And we try to tell them what are the kind of the boundaries that they can set for themselves. I don't tell people what their boundaries should be. And it doesn't have to be that I set the rules and I have to live by the rules. You can go up and down as needed, but encourage people to be conscious of that and speak up. That's all we can do.
Yeah. Okay, so I've just got a couple more questions, fairly light ones. First one about Holmusk. Okay, so just looking over the next couple of years, not that we can really predict a lot of stuff right now. What does the next couple of years look like for Holmusk? What are you hoping to achieve? I said it was a light question, but I lied.
Well, I have to tell you, region-wise, significantly scale a certain operations and just commercial operations in US, grow significantly in UK, have a long-term partnership established here in Singapore to create kind of a model for what it could be for the future, for the world, and develop the starting parts of what would be a scaled business, or kind of what we did in US. We got to now prove it out that we can do this in China.
Okay, that was a kind of more rounded answer than I thought I was going to get, so that's great. So my final question is a little bit just more, again, like I said, a lot of people who listen to this and a lot of the networks it goes out onto is a lot of kind of startup areas. So like you've given perspective. So is there any last piece of advice really that you would give to anyone who's joining as you did, or thinking of kind of starting their own thing? Because I think you've had a lot of friends also have done that, and you work closely with Noel, who started Holmusk. So is there any nugget of advice you would say to people thinking of going down that way?
For people joining a startup, my only advice is that it's easy to feel like I'm joining a cool thing. That dies off very quickly. So it's important that you like the people and the culture of the place that you're joining, because whatever is it that they're doing, that will change, guaranteed.
Yeah.
Okay, number one. For people who are starting startups or who have started startups, I always say this. It's very common, especially on the tech side, that we look at a problem and we have a really, really good solution. And we think that we should build a startup because we have a solution to a really good problem, an important problem, without thinking about who the hell is going to pay for it. So please have the business plan ready before you jump, because that's where often enough you develop it and then you hit a wall.
Yeah.
Those are my two nuggets.
Okay, and they're great nuggets to leave on. So, Joydeep, I really want to thank you for joining us. Honestly, there's been a lot to learn, sort of about what Holmusk does, about mental health, but also kind of just your advice to people in general. So it's been fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much for the invite.
Of course, and honestly, I'm sure I'll probably have you on again in the future. Maybe both you and Noel at the same time.
Yeah.
Because I think what you're doing is moving very quickly, and I think the discussions around mental health are so pertinent and will only grow. That I think it's just going to be such a hot topic over the next couple of years in terms of, even when we're coming out of a pandemic, which we don't even know what trajectory that is, there is going to be a lot of issues that I think people are going to struggle with.
This is here to stay for a while. Let's put it that way.
Yes. And so on that note, but anyway, I want to thank you, and everyone who listened, thank you for listening. We will have more episodes coming up. You can catch this on, if you're watching it, YouTube, and obviously if you're listening to it, it's on Spotify and places like that. So thank you and goodbye.
Bye bye.